Okay, welcome everyone. We are a bit tight with time, so I'll give a I'm Edgar Roldan, work here in STP. I'm the local organizer. And first of all, I would like to thank the other organizers that are present here, and I will briefly introduce you to them. One is here, Jordan Horowitz, Vaishnavi, and Sar, okay? And also Erika, who is our secretary. You probably met her already. I have a couple of important information to tell you. So first of all, the program was changed at the last minute, so there's a bit of arrangement. Today we have the welcome in Adriatico Guest House. So this is some of you are staying there, so it's downhill. We have the welcome dinner at around 6. Tomorrow is the poster session, I believe, also in Adriatico. And also very important to know is that lunch is from 12:45. Remember this time, because cafeteria is open, but we are many people, so we've been told that we should enter cafeteria from 12:45. Otherwise, we are not guaranteed we will have lunch. Okay, so please take this into account. And someone else asked for a supermarket nearby. I think probably Erika will give you this information. There is one called PAM. You can find you should take bus 6 towards the city. Otherwise, there's one in Barcola, which is walking distance, maybe 20 minutes. So if you need the supermarket, we will give you the information later by email, one of our secretaries. Okay, since we are a bit late in time, I will just introduce Jim Hudspeth, which is our first speaker.
As far as my schedule shows, we're actually early, but I won't.
Sorry, I was too early then.
Can you rest for a few minutes?
Do you want to say something else, or should I
I have nothing else to say. Okay, maybe.
Okay.
Yes.
So before I start, I will take a couple of minutes to thank the committee on behalf of all of us, since I happen to be first. This has been an enormous task, obviously, organizing this international event. And because of COVID, the individuals we met have done it all twice. So it's even worse than usual. And perhaps some things have changed in the last year. I don't know how fast theoretical physics moves. But it's nice anyway that we've come to an equilibrium and everything is ready to go. The other thing I want to say refers to my own talk, which is that it is meant to be coordinated with the second talk, which is by Pascal Martin. We're both talking about the same experimental system, and I'm going, as more of a biologist, to tell you more background about the rather complicated system, what it's for, why we care about it. And Pascal will then flesh out some of the phenomena by talking about the theoretical physical background of our current understanding. So what I am talking about is hearing, and more specifically, the sensory receptor cells that are responsible for our hearing. These are called hair cells, and you'll see in a moment why they're called that. They have nothing to do with this kind of hair. They are called that, as you will see, just because they have little subcellular hairs, little bristles on the individual cells. But it's a name we're more or less stuck with. We're interested in these cells for two reasons. One of them is the reason that I will present today, and that is the theoretical and biophysical aspects of the problem. But I should mention the other feature, which is, of course, that there is a lot of hearing loss in our societies. In Europe or in the United States, each of them has about 30 million people to 40 million people with significant hearing loss. So it's a massive problem. The WHO says that worldwide, the number of people affected is about 450 million. So almost 500 million people have significant hearing problems. So almost all of those problems, the great majority of them, stem from one cause, which is damage to these cells, the hair cells. This can be genetic, it can be due to certain legitimate drugs, it can be due to loud sounds, and it occurs as a function of aging. So there's a lot of interest, not just in how these cells work, but how we might be able to protect them, or how we might be able to repair them or regenerate them to deal with this massive amount of hair cell loss. So here's an example of what our hair cells are doing right now. I don't know, is it possible to lower the lights a little bit? If not, it will be okay. So this is a piece of human speech. It's obviously my speech, so welcome to, wonderful. Little more, a little more. This is welcome to Trieste. And I want you to see just how complicated the sounds are. So the vowel sounds like the well, come, and Trieste are stacks of so-called formants of relatively low frequencies. The consonant sounds are these high frequency ones. So this would be Trieste. And this is going on all the time, right? In the course of a day, you're going to hear tens of thousands of these speech sounds or phonemes. And ordinarily, one understands them all. I mean, it's quite remarkable when you think about it. They were able to decode this mess and tell all these things apart. So this is the job of the inner ear, specifically of the cochlea. So as we all know, sound comes in the ear canal. It passes to the eardrum through these three little bones of the middle ear and into this coil structure of the cochlea, which is the organ that's sensitive to sound. It's also associated with another set of organs, which are the vestibular apparatus. So three semicircular canals give us our sensitivity to angular acceleration. And then there are two other organs, the utricle and sacculus, which are here, and those give us our sensitivity to linear acceleration, including gravity. Now, in a very broad way, the way this apparatus works is cartooned here. The notion is that the cochlea, if you were able to open it up, would be a bone-lined tube about 30 millimeters long. It's filled with liquid, and along its length there is an elastic diaphragm. This is hard to push. Maybe I'll go back here. There's an elastic diaphragm, which is shown in red here, and that can move up and down through the liquid. We can measure its motion by using laser interferometry, bouncing a laser beam off of the object and back into the interferometer. And when we do that, we might anticipate to first order that increasing the pressure outside, namely a compression, would simply move the bones to the right, increase the pressure in the upper compartment, and push down the basilar membrane. And a rarefaction would have the opposite effect down here. So you might expect this basilar membrane, this structure, to oscillate like a guitar string. But instead, it's anisotropic. It's not homogeneous. And as a consequence of that, it does not move as a unit. Instead, it acts like a little Fourier analyzer, a frequency filter. It breaks down complicated sounds into their respective frequency components. So low frequencies are represented here at the apex. High frequencies are represented here at the base. Other frequencies are represented in between. And the nice thing about it is this analytic component. A complex sound such as my voice represents high frequencies here, low frequencies here, and other sound frequencies in between. And this is going on constantly to break down complicated sounds such as the one I showed you. That information, which is then spread out along the length of the organ, is then represented by nerve fibers at a particular place. So first, these yellow cells are the hair cells, to which I'll come in just a second. When they're excited by a vibration at this place, they activate nerve fibers, particularly these red ones and the orange and yellow ones. Those carry information into the brain. So as you're listening, everything you hear represents a pattern of nerve fiber activation down here, which is where the brain would be, representing different frequencies, low, medium, and high. Now, if we look down upon this long membrane, the basilar membrane, from above, we see the tops of the sensory receptors, the tops of the hair cells. And they have this very irregular geometric pattern. So they come in two types. Where's my pointer go? Okay. I can't see it. Okay. So there are a row of inner hair cells, which are these cells on the left. Here we have about a dozen of them. And on the right are so-called outer hair cells, of which there are something like 20 or 30. And each of them has at the top these little hairs sticking out that give them their name. And here's one of them shown at a higher power. This is a so-called outer hair cell. We have in each cochlea about 16,000 of these cells total. Now, 16,000 sounds like a lot, but 16,000 is similar to the number of cells, say, in one hair of your head or a bit of skin or something. It's not very many, and your entire hearing depends on that. When these cells are damaged or lost, they are not replaced. So our hearing gradually tends to deteriorate with age and with the various conditions that I mentioned. Hair bundles are very characteristic among all of the vertebrates. So this at the left is a reptile, in the middle a bird, a chicken, and the right a mammal. And the characteristic features are, first of all, that every hair bundle has more or less a plane of bilateral symmetry. So it's symmetric about this axis, it's asymmetric about the opposite axis. Secondly, in every case, the little hairs, which are called stereocilia, start short on one side of the bundle and go progressively longer as you move across. So there's always this tapered appearance of the bundle. And those two things correspond with the sensitivity of these cells. A mechanical deflection that moves from left to right towards the tall edge excites the cell. A mechanical deflection in the opposite direction inhibits it, and an orthogonal deflection does nothing at all. So these cells are highly directional, and that's of course valuable in our vestibular apparatus, because as I move around, I can close my eyes and I can measure a series of accelerations. I can integrate those, say twice, and come back to where I started. So this is very important that they have this vectorial sensitivity. A lot of what we're going to talk about in these two lectures are relatively simple hair cells from the inner ear of the frog, an organ called the sacculus. And these have a couple of qualities that make them particularly useful. First, they're relatively large. The height is about 7 or 8 micrometers. And secondly, they show this classic pattern of having a short edge and a progressively taller edge. And thirdly, they're very stable, so you can keep them for hours in a dish and study them. It's extremely difficult to study the mammalian inner ear because it's so sensitive to changes in temperature, to oxygen, and what have you. The other thing we can do with these is to stimulate them mechanically. So instead of using sound, we can take a glass probe, such as the one here, and apply it to an individual hair bundle and push it in the, say, excitatory direction. And when we do that, we see two things. First of all, the hair bundle moves as a unit. The whole thing moves together. It doesn't fly apart. And secondly, the individual stereocilia stay quite straight. So if we take this long one here, that I'm trying to follow, you see that it's pivoting at its base, but it's not bending or bowing along its length. So it follows that if these two arms represent stereocilia, when the hair bundle moves, they slide with respect to each other. Okay? And that sliding then is actually what excites them, what actually stimulates them. The reason for that is that they are interconnected at their tips by fine molecular filaments. Those fine filaments are made of molecules called cadherins, and there's one stretching from the tip of each short stereocilium to the side of the next longer one in front. Now, a very simple model for how all of this works is shown here. At rest, the hair bundle sits more or less upright. There's not much tension in these yellow tip links. The channels at their base, which are shown in blue with a little red gate, those channels are mostly closed. But if we move the hair bundle in the excitatory direction to the right, now the shearing between the stereocilia will put tension in the tip links. They will tend to open the channels, and now ions, particularly potassium and a little bit of calcium, can flow in. Those cations depolarize the cell. They make its interior more positive. The cell now releases a synaptic transmitter. That transmitter excites the nerve fibers. They send information into the brain. So this is a very simple mechanism of transduction, but it has two strong virtues. One is it's very fast, because there are no biochemical steps, no so-called second messengers. But instead, as rapidly as you can move the hair bundle, these events occur and the channels open. And secondly, it's very, very sensitive. There's no intrinsic threshold. An arbitrarily small stimulus, if integrated long enough, will give rise to a significant response that can then be sent into the brain. There are a number of advantages to these cells in our kinds of investigations. First, as you can see at the right, they're very stereotyped. They all look alike. So we don't have to pick and choose. We can count on the same observations being replicated again and again. Secondly, as I said, the preparation is experimentally accessible and very durable. Third, we can measure conjugate variables. So we can measure displacement and force, and therefore we can estimate power or work. We can measure the voltage and the current across the cellular membrane, and again, estimate the power flow there. There are only a couple of important degrees of freedom, and that's a great thing about this. I mean, the story of biology is so often that you have a cell and it has dozens or hundreds of degrees of freedom, all these terrible things going on at the same time. Here, there are only two things that really count. One is the motion of the hair bundle along that axis of sensitivity. The other is the state of adaptation, and you'll see adaptation in a minute, but it basically says that wherever the hair bundle is, it adapts to that position, becomes sensitive at that point. So if you move it to one side or the other, it resets itself to be sensitive there. And finally, the system is optimized to deal with a couple of evolutionary pressures that are very strong. It operates at thermal energy. It's working just a very thin hair above kT. This is unlike, say, vision. I mean, in the case of vision, one photon is worth 100 kT, something like that. It's extremely energetic. So the signal-to-noise ratio is absurdly large. Here, the signal-to-noise ratio is 1 or even less because one can integrate over multiple cycles of a sinusoidal stimulus. You can dig things out of noise. And the other thing about them is there is pressure on them to be energetically efficient. Your survival, or at least our ancestors, depended on the quality of the hearing. So if you can hear the tiger before the tiger hears you, or if you can hear your dinner, or pizza, whatever it is, if you can hear it before the pizza hears you, then you can capture it and you survive. But on the other hand, if your hearing is not so great, then you lose and your ancestry is finished. So this system is very highly optimized in those terms, and again, you'll see manifestations of that in the presentation. The most amazing thing about it is that this is not just a passive sensory system. Many of our senses, say pressure, say smell, they all involve capture of some sort of stimulus and interpretation of that stimulus as nerve impulses. The ear is remarkable in having these four qualities. It has an active process. It amplifies mechanical inputs by something like 100 to 1,000 times, so that we're sensitive down to a fraction of a nanometer of movement in the ear. It has a very sharp frequency selectivity. So a trained musician can hear 0.1% differences in tone. That's 1/60th of the difference between two keys on a piano. So it's extreme high sensitivity. And you can see the virtue of that in understanding the speech sounds that I showed you. Third, the system has enormous compressive nonlinearity, enormous dynamic range. So from 0 decibels, the approximate threshold, to 120 decibels, which is really painful and damaging, that's 6 orders of magnitude, a million-fold range of sound intensity, and, excuse me, a trillion-fold, 10 to the 12th range in sound power. So there's not any other system I know of that can accommodate 12 orders of magnitude of power. And finally, there's something very weird. 70% of normal humans will actually emit sound from their ears in a suitably quiet environment, in a sound chamber. This is not just some resonance, it's active. You can measure it at a distance of even meters. So what it shows is that there is something active in there that's burning biological fuel, it's burning ATP in order to produce sound power. And it's another strong indication, as all of these are, of this active process and of energy dissipation. We can measure the system by applying a fine glass fiber to the top of the hair bundle, which is seen over here. Here's the glass fiber. If we move the base of the glass fiber, as shown here, that pulls the hair bundle in the same direction, but also, because the fiber is flexible, it bends. So if we know how stiff the fiber is and how much it's bent, we can measure the forces being produced by the hair bundle or by the fiber on one another. So we can then study those 4 manifestations of the active process. And we find, to our surprise, that all 4 manifestations occur in individual hair bundles. It's not downstream, it's not in the brain, it's nowhere else. It's in the hair bundles themselves. So first of all, amplification. And I should say this is Pascal's work. You recognize this. If you move the base of the fiber, sorry. Lost, okay, we go. If this represents the base of the fiber, when we begin to move it back and forth, we see that the hair bundle, which is previously bouncing around irregularly, suddenly latches onto it. It phase locks with a one-to-one relationship, and the response in this case is about twice as big as the stimulus. So there is an enhancement of the size, there is amplification. And you can show, in fact, that the thing is producing work. You can sum the forces. Whatever external force you give with the stimulus is going to be added to the inertial force, the drag force, and the elastic force, Newton's laws, and then whatever active force the hair bundle might be producing. And if you integrate that over a full cycle, the conservative forces, the inertial force and the elastic forces, ought to vanish. And we're left with the fact that the active force ought to be equal and opposite the force that's produced by drag in blue and the force that's produced by the external stimulus, the fiber, which is in brown or beige. And we can then measure those. So here at the top is the motion of the base of the fiber. Here's the motion at the tip. And notice two things. The motion at the tip is, again, bigger than that at the base. You can already see that there's some amplification. You can also see that there's a phase advance. So the phase of this response, say here, it's particularly striking, is advanced with respect to the stimulus. So these are both hints of activity. If we calculate the drag that's being produced, it's down here at the bottom. And if we integrate it, we see the work done on the bundle by drag, which is negative, right? It's eating up energy. It's minus 30 zeptojoules. Now we ask what work is being done on the bundle by the fiber. And that's where the surprise is, because that work is also negative in sign. So instead of the fiber doing work pulling the bundle, we find that an active bundle is doing work on the fiber as well. So when we add those two terms, we find that there's a net average active work per cycle of about 80 zeptojoules. So that would be on the order of 20 kT per cycle. And as Pascal will show you later, this turns out to be a major underestimate, but it does show that the system is active and that it is dissipative. The other thing you can do just as a control is to take a cell, do this operation, measure activity, and then keep beating on the cell until it finally gets tired and ceases to work actively. Now these two terms are roughly equal and opposite, they cancel out. So the fiber is doing a certain amount of work moving the bundle, that work is then going into dissipation owing to drag. So everything adds up. The second feature of the active process is the frequency tuning. This is a low frequency organ, so it's tuned in this case to something just around 10 hertz. But you can see there's a sharp peak in tuning at that frequency. If we wait until the hair bundle dies, the response becomes much weaker, and you can see the response is lower for lower frequencies or for higher frequencies. So there is tuning. Next, there is response compression. If we measure sensitivity, the ratio of the input the ratio of the sensitivity of really how much does the hair bundle move per unit of force applied, we find this very striking nonlinearity. It's extremely sensitive for very, very small forces. It gets less sensitive for higher ones, and it finally saturates to this asymptotic level of a passive hair bundle. Now, these data can be replotted in a logarithmic form, and they show something quite striking, which is that sensitivity, the thing I just showed you, when plotted this way, is more or less flat at low frequencies, but then shows the slope of minus 2/3 as you go to higher and higher frequencies. Sorry, not frequencies. It's flat at low displacements. It shows a slope of minus 2/3 with greater and greater displacements. And that slope is sort of a weird one. It shows that the sensitivity is falling in this peculiar 2/3 power law, but that's something that's consistent with a bifurcation, with a Hopf bifurcation, in fact. So in a Hopf bifurcation, whose formula is up here, this is getting harder and harder to it's like a video game, but worse. The rate of change of the parameter z, which is a complex parameter including displacement and adaptation, follows this particular relationship. And the key point is that if you're at the bifurcation point, if you're at the right frequency, you find that the response goes as the 1/3 power of the forcing, the sensitivity goes as the minus 2/3 power. That's exactly what we observe. And in fact, if the parameter mu, the control parameter, is negative, the system is quiescent in the absence of stimulation. But if the parameter is positive, it will go into limit cycle oscillation, which we think accounts for that active production of sound. Here, in fact, is an oscillating hair bundle. This is from a frog, and you're looking down on it, but you can see this semi-regular oscillation. And here are records from a number of these cells showing the oscillation as a function of time. Now, where does this come from? A striking feature of these cells is that they're mechanically nonlinear if you simply measure their instantaneous relationship between displacement and force. So this can be done a number of ways, but with those little probes that I showed you. Hooke's law is shown by the linear blue stripe, but you can see that there's this sort of segue in the curve that we actually measure. And that comes about as a result, it turns out, of the opening and closing of channels. So here's a channel. It has a gate, it has a hole, which is the pore, and it has a tip link, which breaks periodically. And so the idea is this: if suppose this is one stereocilium, this is another. If I move that hair bundle to your right, as it moves, the channel pops open, ions run in. As I go this way, the channel recloses, and so on. Now, if you came up and measured the stiffness of my arms, as you push to the right, you would measure some stiffness owing to the stretching of the rubber band and the elasticity of the system. And it's true, the same measurement if the channel is closed or if it's open. But the interesting thing is that if you begin to push, and while you're pushing, the channel opens, then the string goes slack. So there's a range of motion in which the thing is less stiff. And that's exactly what we see. The hair bundle goes from a stiff regime to a softer regime, and then asymptotically recovers the stiff regime. Still more striking is that if the hair bundle is very, very healthy, one begins to see a negative slope stiffness. So the bundle actually inflects, or the sensitivity, or the stiffness actually inflects, and there's a negative component here. So this is extraordinary, and it seems to be due to the activity of the ion channels. On the left, we see 3 records of a given hair bundle oscillating. The green shows limit cycle oscillations. Then at this point, we spray onto the bundle a substance called gentamicin that blocks the channels in one configuration. It's just like putting a rat in the trap. While the rat is stuck in the trap, the thing can't open and close anymore. And we now find that in that configuration, we get a perfectly linear Hookean behavior shown by the red line. But both before and after that, we can see this inflection, the region of negative stiffness. So what we think is happening then is that each of these channels, of which here I've put 3 of them in parallel, has a little gate attached to these springs. If we apply a force to it, that force is applied to all of them, and it may cause one channel to pop open. When a channel opens, it relaxes its spring. That means there's more force in the other 2 springs, including the channel. And now that channel may open as well. So we finally get 2 and then 3 channels opening. So the system tends to show avalanche behavior. At low force, all the channels are closed. At high force, they're all open. But in between, it jumps between the 2. And in fact, this is the same thing as you've seen re-represented. The key thing is there's a stable fixed point here. There's a stable fixed point here. There's an unstable fixed point between. But in those intervening regions, the system cannot be stable. You cannot just place it there and leave it. So how might it be placed there? And it turns out that there's a mechanism, and this was discovered by Joe Howard, who's here. There's a mechanism of adaptation that moves the hair bundle into that region. In very brief, the adaptation occurs when you apply a step stimulus to the system. You see an influx of current, which is this downward spike, and then a fast relaxation and a slow relaxation. And particularly during that slow relaxation, you can see that the displacement of the hair bundle increases. Okay, it moves farther. So it's as though I push on something, and then during the relaxation, it sags farther. It says that something is being mechanically reset, and that something that's being reset is associated with the channel's gating. Now, this is a myosin-based process, and that means it's relatively slow. Here, the time constant is on the order of tens of milliseconds. but there are a large number of these molecules in parallel with each other. And Florian Berger, who's here also, has done calculations suggesting that working in concert, these might be able to cause relaxations and motions that are much faster, including motions that are down on the millisecond or sub-millisecond level. So right now, we're not sure about what causes the phenomenon of hair bundle activity, but one candidate is myosin. There is indeed a specialized myosin called myosin 1C at the tips of the hair bundle. And in fact, we think that what could be happening is that that myosin 1C could be running up and down the stereocilia along actin cables and controlling the tension in each tip link. In any event, what we do know is that adaptation involves the entry of calcium into the cell. So if we start with the hair bundle in the resting position and deflect it, channels open, calcium comes in. One way or the other, the entry of calcium closes the channels. And as you can appreciate, closing the channels tensions the tip link. Tensioning a tip link causes a force back in the negative direction. So the hair bundle is a little machine. You push it in one direction, it jerks back and does work on you in the opposite direction. And that work can be harnessed. Here's how. If we apply a sinusoidal stimulus, the green arrow to the right and then back to the left, in each cycle, channels open, calcium comes in, calcium recloses channels. The reclosure produces a negative force, shown here in red, which augments the stimulus force and adds a bit of energy in each cycle. In fact, if you make a simple model of that, it has the right behavior. A relatively low force produces a small deflection of a passive bundle. Even if the channels can open and close, the response is very small. But if you harvest the energy of calcium entering and binding, you can make a little turbine, a little engine that runs, and in fact, it amplifies by 100 times as we want. It has sharp frequency tuning for any set of parameters. It shows compressive nonlinearity. So the gain gets less and less as we turn up the magnitude of the stimulus. Finally, if one gives a constant stimulus, as shown here, but gradually changes that control parameter of the Hopf bifurcation mu, you will cross the bifurcation and the system will begin to produce a limit cycle oscillation. So in the last few seconds, I will say that if one can predict what the state diagram for such a system should look like, there should be sensitivity to the stiffness of the fiber, sensitivity to the force produced by the fiber. We can measure that by controlling those two parameters. And when we do, we see something like what we expect. Namely, we see a locus, shown here in red and pink, in which the hair bundle is spontaneously active. It's inactive in the region around, which is shown in dark brown or black. Moreover, as we move towards the front end, towards the nose of this fish, as it were, the amplitude goes down. As we move towards the nose of the fish, the frequency goes up, and those things are both predicted in our state diagram. Finally, the system is most responsive at the bifurcation. So if we work near the bifurcation, a little bit on the oscillatory regime, we get the strong response. If we move to the quiescent region outside the fish's nose, we get just passive sorts of behavior. Finally, we think that the system exhibits self-tuned criticality. So if you're in a loud environment out on the street, you don't need any gain. As you move into an environment like where you are now, you may have a little bit of gain, but you don't need much. In your room at night, if it's quiet, you move into this borderline region where the system is maximally effective and sensitive. Finally, if you're in a sound booth and there's no sound at all, then the system begins to oscillate spontaneously. So I'll close just by saying there are advantages to working at a Hopf bifurcation. You get the things I showed you already. You get amplification, frequency tuning, and compressive nonlinearity. A Hopf bifurcation can be done with just 2 or more dimensions, so it's relatively simple. It can be tuned or brought to criticality with just one parameter. It's local about a fixed point. And the nice thing is at that fixed point, the frequency stays more or less the constant as you move from the stable to the unstable regime. And finally, as epiphenomena, it generates 2 things. It generates the spontaneous emissions. It also generates these nonlinearities. So even musicians sometimes use the fact that if you play 2 tones, F1 and F2, you can literally hear twice F1 minus F2, twice F2 minus F1. This was discovered in 1714 by Tartini, and I just found his statue in Ravenna. So I'll stop there, and thank you all for your gracious attention.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. So I open the room for questions. Let's, okay, we'll set a rule to give the word first to students and postdocs. I saw some hands already. I don't know if...
At the very back.
To encourage participation of youngest.
Very nice talk. I have a bit of an annex question about the channel. So it seems to open by this fiber. Is it actin? Is it cadherin? So like they're cadherin plus actin, I guess?
So the exact answer to that we do not yet know. What we know is at the top of the stereocilium, there is one or there are probably a couple of channels. The channels have at least 4 components. I mean, the molecules don't make much difference, but they're called TMC, TMIE, TMHS, and then one that's called CYP2. And this last one, CYP2, is sensitive to calcium, so it may be involved. So the tip link itself has 2 components. There's a dimer of one kind of cadherin, cadherin 23. There's a dimer of another cadherin, which is called protocadherin 15, PCDH15. And then this is attached up here, we believe, to myosin molecules. So exactly what happens down here is not yet known. There's some crystallographic evidence. There is strong mutational evidence that this is the channel, because if you mutagenize specific residues there, it controls how much current can flow and what flavor of ions can flow. But exactly what happens at this magic place is not known. And the other thing we don't know is what is the relaxation, which I've shown very primitively as a little gate. I can tell you that that is not actually the case. And in fact, there's a peculiarity, which Pascal might touch upon. If we ask how far does this gate move, it can move as much in our formulation as 8 nanometers. Now, that's enormous in terms of proteins. So there's something else going on. Maybe calcium binding is releasing something, whatever. We do not know.
Thank you.
More questions from students?
There's one over here. Okay.
Okay.
In the graph where you showed you spray the chemical to block the channel, the inflection after the recovery was not the same as the one before. Is this because of something of the cell, or is it because of
I think
the
the cell just got tired. What he's referring to is, you're quite right, that while it was blocked, it was more or less linear. Before, it may have been like that, and afterwards it may have been like that. I mean, Pascal did it. No, the cells get tired. I mean, we do see progressive rundown. Of course, we only show things we've seen multiple times. As with all physiology, we show a typical case, which is the best that ever happened.
Yes, very nice talk. So my question, we go to that channel. So what happens if you vary the calcium concentration?
Yes. So first of all, the calcium is a weak blocker of this channel. So the pore through the channel is negatively charged, and calcium will go in and stick somewhat. So it's rather paradoxical, because calcium is an important messenger going through the channel and effecting adaptation. But at the same time, if you have too much calcium, then it will plug up the channel and potassium can't flow through. So it turns out that calcium carries about 3% of the current. 97% is carried by the potassium. The other thing that's interesting is a site-directed mutagenesis, or actually an existing mutant that was found in mice. It's called Beethoven, because they're deaf mice. That affects the calcium permeability and causes hearing loss.
Thanks again for this very beautiful talk. I just have a simple question. You said that this dip in the response function occurred when you were looking at healthy cells.
Yes.
So just wondering, what does it mean for healthy cells?
Right. The argument, I would say, is probably circular, because if we see the nonlinearity, we say they're healthy. No, you know, as with all things physiological, you're trying to catch something alive in a bottle before it dies. When you do a good dissection, you know it. When you get a beautifully mounted preparation, you know it. You can see those things with your eyes. Now you start recording. When you start recording, if everything goes smoothly and you don't break things and all of that, you get this phenomenon. As time goes on, you see gradual deterioration. You may follow the same cell or successive cells, but it's very likely that the first one will show this, and with time, you will, you know, gradually move to a regime in which the nonlinearity is much more weak, and in which you no longer have a negative slope. You simply have this segue between the two states, the closed state and the open state. Okay. We can also, I mean, if you don't believe it, it's easy to make the cell sick. Right, so if we put in any number of drugs, if it gets too warm, if we change the osmotic strength, anything that causes grief to the cell will tend to linearize it. And if you cause enough grief, much like death, you get just plain linearity, period.
Of course. Yeah. Great, thank you.
More questions from students?
There's one above you.
Back there? Yes.
Nice talk. Now, question is, what could be the evolutionary significance of spontaneous oscillations?
Okay, yeah, so what are the spontaneous oscillations for? We know of no significance. We think that the spontaneous oscillations are an epiphenomenon that are a manifestation of the active process, but when it's not working in its normal regime. And I'll tell you what's not normal about the situation. The particular organ we're looking at has a flat epithelium, and in that flat epithelium, there are 2,000 hair cells, and those 2,000 hair cells have the usual hair bundles. On top of that is a gelatinous structure, it's called the otolithic membrane, and on top of that, amazingly enough, are just plain rocks. They're calcium carbonate crystals, and this is what we have in our own ears for our vestibular apparatus, right? Because if I want to measure an acceleration, it's very easy to do. If I have an apparatus like this and I move up suddenly, the greater inertia of the rocks will cause this to move to the left and will stimulate those bundles. Now, in the case of the frog, the organ is used both for that, but also for measuring vibrations in the ground. We have lost track of vibrations in the ground because we're too tall. Our heads are up here normally. But if you're an animal like a frog and you spend your time like that, there's very close coupling between the ground, those muscles and bones in your ear. And that system, in fact, is so sensitive that some frogs can respond to 1/10 of a micro-G, 10 to the minus 7 Gs of acceleration. So if you try to sneak up on a frog, the frog can feel you, not hear you coming, okay? So when we do our experiments, we take off all of this stuff. We peel it off with enzyme treatment. Therefore, these are no longer feeling the load that they normally do. And I think that they then tend to oscillate spontaneously more than they do in the attack preparation. Okay. We're also trying to find out right now why the oscillations can occur in our own inner ears. You know, what's special about it? Those occur in normal ears. They're not pathological. Young kids have them. As we get older and older, we tend to lose them. So that's what we know.
Can this be equated to something that happens in the brain as well, like spontaneous oscillations in the brain?
These are probably not coupled to any spontaneous oscillation in the brain. Remember, these are occurring in the human ear at kilohertz range. It goes up to 20 kilohertz or something like that. Brain activity, EEG, and things like that is, of course, in the hertz range, up to 20, 30, 40 hertz, or something of this sort. Again, it's rather remarkable, and again, a sign of energy dissipation. These bundles are sloshing back and forth in liquid at up to 20 or 30 kilohertz. Bats can go up to 70 kilohertz that we know about with spontaneous oscillations. So it's burning a lot of fuel.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't know if there are more questions from students. Not, okay, you are here.
Yeah, thank you. Is there a simple explanation for understanding the logarithmic behavior of the sensitivity with respect to displacement, at least for small displacement, which would be like a Weber-Fechner law? I mean, is that what you're talking about there? So
that emerges from something operating at the Hopf bifurcation. But the input-output relationship itself, if we simply ask, what is the open probability of the channel as a function of deflection, that is a nice Boltzmann curve, like that. And so we start with an open probability of maybe 20%, moving in the positive direction increases the channel opening, moving in the negative closes the channels.
So the logarithm is related to that, you believe? Because, I mean...
What did you say, Pascal? He wishes he could answer the question. I guess I do, too. I wish he could answer the question.
If I can follow up on that question, it seems that the analysis is mostly mechanical or even dynamical systems. Is there any room here for more statistical mechanical arguments, or is that...
Well,
or is it not necessary at all?
It seems to be not necessary. Bill Bialik, a very long time ago, tried to make statistical mechanical arguments about what might be the limiting sensitivity of the system. Is the thing, in fact, limited by quantum effects, for example? And at that time, he had some sense that that might be the case. I think even he disavows that now. I mean, he had chosen a set of observations which together gave the sense that it might be that sensitive. But I think the evidence is pretty compelling that the system is sensitive down to the level set by thermal oscillations, well above the level of quantum effects, and that this system with the sharp tuning helps to dig a signal out of that noisy environment.
Noise is not essential here. Noise is not helping to hear better.
Noise is helping to hear better in some ways, and in fact, I think Pascal will touch upon that. One of the ideas that we're thinking about right now, and this is work of Dolores Bosevich, is the one problem with the Hopf bifurcation is that you would expect near criticality to see critical slowing. And we don't want that, right? If you were, again, if there's a tiger or something coming after you and something happens, you want to hear it immediately. You don't want to integrate for a long time and say, yes, that was probably a tiger after the fact. So one possibility is that noise helps by instantiating a chaotic regime. And she has evidence that this could be the case. And in that circumstance, the system is more rapidly responsive than it would be. The other thing to be said is this is not a naked Hopf bifurcation, right? It doesn't show perfect asymptotic behavior and so on. It is immersed in noise. So you don't see a sharp transition. And Pascal and Jacques Pro and others did a renormalization of the Hopf system to see what the effect of the noise is on the actual shape of the bifurcation itself.
Thank you. Very nice talk. I have two questions. And the first question is to understand better how you manipulate on the hair bundles, or you use an optical fiber or something, or a needle, microneedle. And the second question is, can you see in this instability region, can you see hopping? Can you see the gates opening and closing, although there are many of them, but can you see, like in ion channels, that you can see them hopping between the two conformations?
Yes. Okay.
Thank you.
So on the first point, the way of stimulating that I showed you is to take a fiber that is orthogonal to this. It will actually stick to the hair bundle. You can now move the fiber back and forth in this direction and move the hair bundle, or the hair bundle can move the fiber. You can also use photonic force. So we found that if you take an optical fiber and taper it appropriately and aim it at the bundle, you can push it back and forth. It's that sensitive. And that doesn't take particularly high illuminance to do it. The other question, oh yeah. So in fact, you can. I mentioned the fact that we have this behavior. So this is, again, a stable fixed point and a stable fixed point. And even noise can knock you back and forth between the two, a bistable system. So you can see records that look very much like a telegraph process with noise sitting on top of it and bouncing back and forth. Or you can see that powered, with bigger steps and a limit cycle type of oscillation, a relaxation oscillator. We estimate something on the order of 90 to a few hundred, depending on the number of stereocilia. It's order of 1 or 2 per stereocilium. We're now officially out of time, even though I stole some time from Edgar.
Yeah, as far as I know, tinnitus occurs for some it's more common for high frequencies, tinnitus, the tinnitus, I don't know the.
To have damage. Right?
Tinnitus,
Oh, tinnitus.
tinnitus.
Oh, yeah,
sorry.
sorry. Yeah, yeah.
Tinnitus.
I didn't get it. Yeah.
Tinnitus is more common for high frequencies,
Yes, that's right.
which means that the cells go to self-oscillation regime for, it's easier for them if they are sensitive to high frequencies.
No, so that's not the case. So tinnitus is ringing in the ears. As you say, it's often at high frequencies. But it's not because of active motion. It's actually in the brain. So the sensation is the same as hearing. What happens is similar to what happens with so-called phantom limb pain. If you have a cut hand, you lose your hand or something, or lose an arm or whatever, you may have pain from the missing area. And this is because the signals that ordinarily go from there to this side of the brain are missing. The brain apparently becomes more sensitive. It turns itself up, trying to detect the signals that are no longer coming until it goes unstable. And then that instability is felt in the brain as a pain in this hand. So in fact, when you have tinnitus, it's usually at high frequencies, but that's unfortunately because you've usually lost your sensitivity to those high frequencies. So a normal hearing curve shows high sensitivity here, low sensitivity here, high sensitivity here, and again rolls off here. With time, you tend to lose the high frequencies, and with time, you begin to hear tinnitus in that range. I can hear mine right now.
Very nice talk. Just a very quick and most likely naive question. You mentioned the mechanisms by which you have forces, myosin, for example. You have these membrane potentials that are crucial for you. Does surface tension of the membrane itself play any role in how this thing is structured?
We don't know. Of course, there's no surface tension air-water interface. This is all under liquid. So the real question is the membrane significantly stiff? I mean, in general, membranes themselves are extraordinarily soft. And we expect the same is here, also the case. Sometimes as a preparation dissipates or as it runs down, we would begin to see the stereocilia making little blebs of membrane like that. That's usually not good news. They're extremely soft, right? We see them oscillating around under thermal motion, very high time scale. What is important is just under the membrane is a so-called cortex, which has actin, spectrin, fodrin. That's stiff, and that has not been very well characterized. But it probably has a significant role. And remember, there are actin filaments here. So the actin filaments here act as an elastic element that opposes the forces applied to the hair bundle. Igor, you're making me feel guilty, but...
I have a question about the response of the hair bundle to different waveforms. So if, let's say, instead of a sinusoidal signal extended in time, we would send like a Gaussian packet with the average frequency or some wavelet. Are there any qualitative differences in the response, which you know?
That I do not know. There's a huge amount of psychophysical literature, on these things, but I'm just not expert in that. I'm trying to sit down, you see.
So thanks for the very nice talk. I was wondering, since this is an active mechanism, if you have seen any dependence on ATP concentration or nutrient concentration like oxygen, glucose, I don't know.
No, we don't have any direct way of measuring that. And as I said, what I've showed you here is a very large underestimate of the total dissipation. Now, it would be interesting to try to measure that total dissipation. Pascal will give you a number for how much larger it is. It's 50 times as big as the number I gave you. So the question is whether on this very tiny distance scale, is there some way of measuring that? It is the case that this is a sort of closed compartment. So the ATP diffusion in and out, ion pumping and so on, all are somewhat limited by the geometry of the situation. And it would be a nice thing to explore, but I don't know a way of doing that as yet.
Thank you for the nice talk. I wanted to ask if there is some element of tuning the response frequency of different cells by making changes with the channels themselves for ion concentration inside an ear.
Yeah, so tuning obviously is very important. And the answer, this being biology, there are 5 answers to it. So first of all, the basilar membrane itself, which is just a piece of meat, right? That thing, as it conducts traveling waves, it's tuned in different places just by its passive elasticity, its passive mass, and so on. The individual hair bundles can act like tuning forks. So in some animals, the hair bundle can be 30 micrometers or more, and in other animals, it can be 1 micrometer or less. Moreover, in this case, there can be as many as 300 of these. In this case, there are only 20. So both the geometry and the numbers lead to very different stiffnesses, orders of magnitude difference, and they act like tuning forks. They tune to different levels. Next, many of these cells, not human ones as far as we know, have electrical tuning. So if you move the hair bundle, the cell becomes more positive. That opens calcium channels. The calcium channels let in calcium. The calcium then interacts with potassium channels and lets out potassium. And you then get an oscillation as calcium, potassium, calcium, potassium come in and out. So this would be the membrane voltage. So if you give a stimulus, you get that when the stimulus goes off. And interestingly, that too can be tuned. If you have more of these channels, you now get a higher oscillation frequency. That's, I think, 4. And then the last thing is what you posited. The active process itself is somehow tuned. We do not yet know the particulars of how that's done. So the dynamical system has got a characteristic time, and we're trying to understand it.
Yeah, thanks for the beautiful talk. I think my question has just been addressed. So I was just wondering, what is this control parameter that moves the system over this bifurcation point?
Yeah, I'll give you $1,000 if you can tell me by the end of the meeting. We don't know what it is. And we know, it should be there, and we see cells flickering in and out of activity and so on. We know some circumstances that conduce to it. We know it seems to be sensitive to calcium. It may be sensitive to cyclic AMP, right? People know cyclic AMP is a product of ATP that's often used in internal signaling. So we've used a set of molecules in experiments, again, collaboratively with Pascal, that affect this, and they do affect the frequency and the extent of the oscillation. But I can't say, here's a particular molecule, and we would really like to be able to turn that up and down, because we'd like to do it in the mammal, to be able to turn it on and off.
Okay, so I'll give the word for the last question, because this is becoming a course more than a seminar.
I want Pascal to have a chance.
Jim, you're talking about the, the work that you need to do to open the channels. But what about, how does that compare? I mean, maybe you touched on that before, with the amount of energy that's dissipated through by the opening of the channels and the, the flow of currents and what have you. I mean, what is the relative amount of energy that you put in to gate the channels compared to the amount of energy that is dissipated during, during the actual the opening of the channel and the pumping of all of those ions back out of the...
Yeah, I think the answer to that depends on the specific circumstances. I mean, remember that the opening and closing of a channel itself is energetically conservative, right? There's no energy necessarily involved in that. Mm-hmm. You're right that the current flowing through that is quite substantial and does represent a lot of dissipation. And that dissipation can certainly be greater than the amount that I showed you in that mechanical work. But again, as I said, that mechanical work turns out to be a lot less than the actual total mechanical work. We're just measuring the tip of it.
Let's thank again Jim for the talk and all this great discussion. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Put your hand out and I'll give you this. Oh, sorry.